My name is Elena. I'm 32 years old, and 8 months ago, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when my mother called to tell me that my husband had just been pulled from the river. I almost dropped the phone, because my husband was standing 10 feet away from me, reading the news on his tablet. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I need you to understand that I am not a dramatic person. I don't exaggerate. I don't spiral. I'm a certified public accountant who has spent the last 9 years finding errors in other people's numbers, and I am very good at it because I trust what I can verify and nothing else. So, when I tell you that what I am about to share with you destroyed everything I thought I knew about my own life, I want you to understand the weight of those words coming from someone like me. My husband and I had been married for 8 months when it happened. His name is Michael. We met at a work conference in Chicago, dated for 2 years, and got married quietly at the courthouse with my mother and his college roommate as witnesses. Michael traveled constantly for his job. He worked in logistics consulting, which meant he was in a different city almost every week. When he was home, we treasured the ordinary moments. Saturday morning coffee, cooking dinner together, falling asleep on the couch watching something neither of us actually wanted to watch. We didn't need grand gestures. We just needed each other, and we had that. That Tuesday morning felt exactly like every other Tuesday. Michael had come home the night before from a 4-day trip to Minneapolis. He was standing at the kitchen island in his gray t-shirt, scrolling through his tablet, occasionally reading me headlines in that dry, half-amused voice I had fallen in love with. I handed him his coffee without looking up. He took it without looking up either. 8 months of marriage, and we already had a language made entirely of small, comfortable gestures. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. She never called that early. Elena. Her voice was wrong immediately. Flat and too careful, the way someone sounds when they are trying very hard not to fall apart. I need you to listen to me. Something happened to Michael this morning. I turned around and looked at my husband. He raised an eyebrow at me. Mom, what are you talking about? Michael is right here. Elena. Her voice cracked. They found him in the river near the Franklin Street Bridge. He's alive, but barely. He's at Mercy General. Baby, you need to come right now. The room tilted slightly. I looked at Michael again. He set down his coffee. He was watching my face. That's not possible, I said slowly. I'm looking at him. Elena, please. The hospital called me because you weren't answering your cell last night. They have his wallet, his ID, his wedding ring. Please just come. Michael walked toward me. He took the phone gently from my hand, the same way you take something sharp from a child. He spoke to my mother in a low, even voice. Asked her which hospital. Listened. Then he handed the phone back to me with a look that managed to be both concerned and completely calm. She's confused, he said. Or the hospital is. Someone probably had a fake ID. You know how that happens. He squeezed my hand. But go. She sounds scared. I'll be here when you get back. I drove to Mercy General in a state that I can only describe as controlled panic. I kept telling myself there was an explanation. A stolen wallet, a mix-up in the system. I was a numbers person. I believed in explanations. In causes that produce logical effects. Two identical situations could not exist at the same time. It wasn't possible. My mother was waiting for me at the entrance. Her eyes were swollen. She grabbed both my hands before I could say anything. She walked me to the 3rd floor. A doctor met us in the hallway, young, serious, with the particular kind of tired that belongs to people who deliver bad news for a living. Mrs. Chen? He looked at me carefully. Your husband is stable. He was pulled from the river around 5 this morning by a jogger who called 911. He had significant hypothermia and blunt force trauma to the back of his head. We believe he was struck before he went into the water. There's been a mistake, I said. It sounded hollow even to me. He opened the door. The man in the bed was connected to monitors and an IV line. His eyes were closed. His face was pale in the particular gray way of people who have lost too much heat. But it was his face. Michael's face. His nose. His jaw. The small scar on his left palm from a kitchen accident he told me about on our 3rd date. I grabbed the doorframe. My mother caught my arm. Elena. I couldn't speak. because the scar on his left palm was the one thing I was absolutely certain about. Michael had shown it to me himself. Told me the whole ridiculous story about trying to catch a falling wine glass and grabbing the broken stem instead. I had kissed that scar. I knew it the way I knew my own face. The man on the bed had it. The man in my kitchen had it too. I had seen it that morning. I had seen it 100 mornings. I walked back out into the hallway and sat down in a plastic chair and tried to breathe. My mother sat beside me and said nothing, which was the kindest thing she could have done. I called Michael. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, how's your mom? Is everything okay?" His voice was warm, normal. The same voice that had said good morning to me 90 minutes ago. "The man in the hospital," I said carefully. "He has the scar on his left palm." A short pause. Then a small, easy laugh. "Elena, lots of people have scars on their hands. Don't do this to yourself. Come home when you're ready. I'll make lunch." I sat at that hospital for 3 hours. I watched nurses check the man in the bed. I watched his chest rise and fall. When a nurse adjusted his IV line, his hand shifted, and I saw the scar again, pale against his paler skin. I drove home and walked through my front door and smiled at my husband and said I was tired, and he made me soup. And I sat across the table from him and watched him eat and felt the world splitting quietly down the middle underneath me. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried to build a framework that made sense. They were twins. Michael had a twin he'd never mentioned. Someone had stolen his identity in a very specific and elaborate way. I was losing my mind from stress. One by one, I held each explanation up to the light and watched it fall apart. I didn't call the police. I want to explain that, because I know it's the first question. I know how it sounds. The reason I didn't call the police that first night is that I had no idea which man to report. The one in the hospital had Michael's ID, Michael's wedding ring, Michael's scar. The one in my house had Michael's voice, Michael's memories, Michael's habits. If I walked into a police station and said, "I think my husband might be an imposter," I would sound unhinged. And something else was stopping me, something I couldn't name yet, a cold instinct that told me to be very careful before I moved. I went back to the hospital the next morning, while the man in my house thought I was at work. The unconscious man had been moved to a private room. His chart at the nurse's station listed his name as Michael Chen, age 34, married. The nurse who updated me said he was still unconscious, but his vitals were improving. I stood at the window of his room for a long time. Then I did something that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. I walked in, and I sat beside the bed. And I took his scarred hand in both of mine, and I whispered, "Michael, if you can hear me, squeeze." Nothing happened for a long moment. Then his fingers pressed weakly against mine. I cried in my car for 20 minutes before I drove home. The man in my house was on a work call when I got back. He smiled at me from across the room and held up one finger 1 minute and kept talking. His posture, his gestures, the way he pushed his hair back from his forehead. Everything looked right. Everything looked exactly like my husband. But I had started watching differently. Over the next few days, I paid attention in a way I never had before. Not to the big things, the things anyone could study and replicate, but to the small involuntary ones. Michael had a habit of tapping his thumb against his knee when he was thinking. A specific rhythm, two fast, one slow. I had never consciously noticed it until I looked for it, and found it missing. The man across the table from me tapped his fingers in no particular pattern. Michael always checked his left coat pocket first, then his right, when he was looking for his keys. This man checked right first. Michael stirred his coffee counterclockwise. This man stirred clockwise, always. Tiny things. Things that meant nothing individually. Things that together felt like a map of someone who had studied a person very hard, but not quite hard enough. I said nothing. I smiled. I cooked dinner. I asked about his day. Every night, I lay awake beside him and felt like I was sleeping next to a very convincing painting of my husband. Then, 8 days after the hospital called, my college friend reached out to me. Her name is Janet. She works in hospital administration, not at Mercy General, but at a clinic across town that handles specialized surgical procedures. She and I hadn't talked in months, but she texted me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I could come by. Not over the phone. In person. Just her and me. Something in the way she wrote it made my hands cold. I told the man in my house I was having dinner with a friend. He kissed me on the cheek and said to have fun. I watched his face as he said it and thought, "You have no idea what is coming for you." Janet locked her office door before she sat down. She looked like she hadn't slept. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said. "I could lose my license for this. But you're my friend, and what I found is Elena. I don't even know how to say this." She pulled up a file on her computer. Patient records, heavily redacted, but with enough visible to understand the shape of what she was showing me. "About 14 months ago," she said quietly, "our clinic treated a patient for an extensive series of elective surgical procedures. Facial reconstruction, rhinoplasty, jaw contouring, implants, hairline modification. The kind of work that takes multiple sessions over several months." She turned the screen toward me. "The before photos where destroyed patients can request that, but the intake documentation lists the goal outcome." She pointed to a line on the screen. "The patient brought in a reference photo. He wanted to look like this person." She showed me a photo. It was Michael. A photo of Michael from what looked like a LinkedIn profile. My lungs stopped working. "The patient's name on intake," Janet said carefully, "was Adrian Moss." The room tilted. I held onto the edge of her desk. Adrian Moss. I knew that name. Michael had mentioned him occasionally, an old friend from college, someone they'd lost touch with years ago, someone Michael described as intense and a little difficult, someone who'd sent a wedding gift I thought was oddly expensive from someone neither of us knew well. "He paid in full, in cash, across 8 separate payments," Janet continued. "The last procedure was completed 11 months ago." She paused. "Elena, I looked him up after I started putting this together. Adrian Moss and your husband were roommates for 3 years in college. And 4 months before Michael's accident, Adrian Moss quietly closed all his social media accounts, terminated his lease in Portland, and disappeared from public records." I sat very still. "There's more," she said. She pulled up a second document. "I have a contact at a data firm who does background checks." She found financial activity connected to a shell account linked to Moss. "He had been monitoring your and Michael's joint assets for at least 2 years. The company you co-own with Michael? The property you inherited from your grandfather? He had records on all of it." I thought about the man in my house pushing his hair back from his forehead. I thought about clockwise coffee. I thought about the wrong pocket. "He didn't just want Michael's face," I said. My voice came out very flat and very quiet. Janet shook her head. "I don't think so." I cried in her office, which I had not done at the hospital, had not done in the car, had not done in all the sleepless nights since this began. I cried until I was empty. Janet sat beside me and didn't say anything useless. Then I dried my face, and I thought about numbers. And I began to plan. Here is what I understood by the time I drove home that night. Adrian Moss had spent years watching my husband. He had likely known Michael since college, known his mannerisms, his stories, the shape of his life. He had chosen a moment when Michael was traveling alone in a city where no one knew him to arrange the accident. He had transformed his face over the course of a year to match Michael's precisely. He had studied everything he could study and then stepped into my life and waited. What he wanted was simple, in the way that obsession always looks simple from the outside. He wanted me. He wanted the life. And he wanted the assets that came with it, specifically the commercial property Michael and I co-owned and the investment portfolio attached to it, which together were worth just over $2 million. He had been pushing, gently and persistently, for me to consolidate legal authority over those assets, suggesting we simplify our financial structure, mentioning a meeting with our lawyer to update the power of attorney. I had been distracted and grieving something I couldn't name, and I had almost said yes. I went home and I smiled, and I said dinner was lovely, and I went to bed. And then, over the next 3 weeks, I became a different kind of accountant. I had spent 9 years finding errors in other people's numbers. Now I applied that same precision to building a case. I contacted Janet's background check connection directly. I pulled records. I cross-referenced Adrian Moss's financial history with dates that mattered: the day Michael fell into the river, the day Adrian first appeared in our neighborhood coffee shop, the day of our wedding, which Michael had told me. Adrian attended briefly and left early. I found security footage from the clinic through a contact of Janet's. I found email threads on a secondary account I discovered on our home computer, threads between Adrian and the surgical team written under a false name. I documented the clockwise coffee, the wrong pocket, the missing rhythm of the thumb on the knee, everything, in a private file I kept on a cloud account he didn't know existed. I also went to the hospital every 3 days. Michael was improving. By the second week, he was conscious and alert, though he had significant gaps in his memory from the trauma. He knew me. He held my hand and looked at me with an expression of such raw relief that I had to look away to keep from breaking down in front of him. I told him everything in small pieces, carefully, watching his face as I did. He told me the rest. He had been in Pittsburgh, not Minneapolis. The night he was attacked, a last-minute change he hadn't told me about because it was so routine it hadn't felt worth mentioning. He'd been hit from behind near his hotel. He remembered nothing after that until the hospital ceiling. He hadn't been able to reach me because his phone was gone, and the hospital had only been able to contact my mother through his wallet. He told me something else. He told me that Adrian Moss had been in love with me before Michael and I ever met. That when Michael had introduced us at that conference, Adrian had been there too, and I had simply never noticed him. Adrian had grown very quiet. That over the years that followed, Adrian had become increasingly strange about it, asking questions about me, mentioning me in contexts where I didn't belong, until Michael had slowly, uncomfortably, created distance between them. "I should have told you," Michael said. His voice was still rough from weeks of disuse. "I didn't think he was dangerous. I thought he was just sad." I squeezed his hand. "I'm going to fix this," I said. "But I need a little more time." The moment came on a Friday afternoon in the conference room of our family attorney's office. Adrian had arranged the meeting weeks before to finalize updates to our power of attorney documents. He believed this was the last step. He had been careful and patient for over a year, and now it was simply a matter of signatures. Our attorney was there, a paralegal, a notary, and 2 other people whose presence Adrian did not know about: a detective from the county DA's office named Reyes, who I had spent 3 meetings briefing, and her partner, both of them waiting just outside the door. Adrian sat beside me at the conference table. He looked confident, relaxed. He was wearing Michael's watch, the one I had given Michael on our first anniversary, and the sight of it on his wrist made something cold and sharp move through my chest. The documents were placed in front of us. Our attorney reviewed the terms. Adrian picked up his pen. I picked up mine. I looked at the paper. I set the pen down. "Before we proceed," I said, "I'd like to show everyone something." I opened my laptop. The first thing I played was the security footage from Janet's clinic. 14 months of Adrian Moss walking in and out of that building, sitting in consultation rooms, lying in surgical chairs, emerging each time slightly more like someone else. The second thing I played was a recording I had made in our kitchen 3 days earlier. I had placed my phone face down on the counter and asked him casually about a scar story I knew he'd need to fabricate. The recording caught every hesitation, every slight pause before answering. The moment where the story he told didn't match the story I knew by heart. The third thing was a document summary prepared by Detective Reyes: the financial transfers, the shell accounts, the communications. The timeline from Pittsburgh to the river to my front door. Adrian Moss did not move for a long moment. The pen was still in his hand. Then he looked at me with an expression I will not be able to fully describe. It was not anger. Exactly. It was something closer to grief, which was the most disturbing part. "Elena," he said quietly. "Don't," I said. The door opened. He stood up fast and said something I couldn't follow, directed at no one in particular, his voice rising. Detective Reyes stepped toward him and said his real name, and watched something collapse in his face. He didn't run. I think some part of him had known, for a long time, that this was always where the story ended. They walked him out of the conference room in handcuffs. He didn't look back at me. I was glad for that. I sat in that conference room for a long time after everyone else had left. The documents were still on the table, unsigned. Our attorney brought me a glass of water and didn't ask me any questions, which was the second kindest thing anyone had done for me through all of this. I sat there and I breathed, and I let the silence be exactly what it was. The trial took 4 months. I attended every day. Adrian Moss had hired a skilled defense attorney who argued psychological disorder, obsessive fixation, diminished capacity. The prosecution presented what I had built: every record, every timestamp, every thread. Michael testified from a wheelchair because he was still in physical therapy. He was calm and precise, and I had never been more certain in my life that I had married exactly the right person. The jury took 11 hours. Attempted murder, identity fraud, financial fraud, conspiracy. The judge sentenced Adrian Moss to 22 years without the possibility of early release. I sat in the gallery and watched them lead him away and felt nothing dramatic, just a settling. The way a building feels after you remove something that was never supposed to be load-bearing. Michael came home 6 weeks after the verdict. I had repainted the kitchen while he was in the hospital, not because anything was wrong with the old color, but because I needed to do something with my hands during those last weeks of waiting. He walked in and stood in the doorway and looked at the new color, a warm, pale green, and said it was perfect. Then he looked at me and said that too, and I laughed for the first time in a very long time, the kind of laugh that happens when relief is so big it has nowhere else to go. That first night home, we sat on the couch. No movie, no particular plan, just the two of us in the quiet of an ordinary evening, and I was aware in a way that I had never been before of how specific and irreplaceable ordinary evenings actually are. The way he holds his coffee cup with both hands even when it isn't hot. The 2 fast taps, one slow, against his knee. The fact that he always checks his left pocket first. I have thought a lot about what I would tell someone who asked me what I learned from all of this. I'm not sure I learned anything that makes for a clean lesson. I learned that obsession can be patient in ways that are almost indistinguishable from love. I learned that the people who want to steal something from you study it more carefully than you do, and that the only thing they can never replicate is the version of it that lives inside you. The private knowing that doesn't exist in any record or photograph or carefully rehearsed story. Adrian Moss spent 14 months transforming his face. He memorized everything a person can memorize about someone else, but he tapped his fingers in the wrong pattern. He stirred his coffee in the wrong direction. He reached for the wrong pocket. He spent a year becoming my husband and never once thought to ask himself what it actually meant to be known by someone who loves you. The scar on Michael's palm healed a little differently than it had before the accident. The cold and the trauma and the weeks in the hospital changed the tissue slightly. It looks different now than it did on our wedding day. I traced it with my thumb last Sunday morning, the two of us still half asleep, and he said without opening his eyes, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Making sure," and he laughed quietly and pulled my hand up to his chest and held it there. That is the part Adrian Moss never understood. The checking is not doubt, the checking is love. It is the particular tenderness of knowing someone so well that you can feel when something is wrong, even when everything looks exactly right. That is not a vulnerability. That is the only thing that saved me. If you've been following along with HeartPath Stories, thank you for staying with this one to the end. This story was shared with me by a listener who asked me to tell it because she wanted other people to understand what it feels like to trust your own perception when the whole world seems to be telling you you're wrong. If something feels wrong to you in your relationship, in your home, in your life, please listen to that. Find one person you trust completely and tell them what you're seeing. The truth is almost always smaller and more specific than the lie trying to cover it. And you already know what the truth looks like. You've been holding it in your hands the whole time. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to HeartPath Stories. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here.